Hey friends, we keep trucking here. This is my part 2 and likely final video on refurbishing and recapping my 1997 Dodge Ram 1500 ECU. Special thanks to Keyworks ECU Repair YouTube channel and JDW YouTube channel for their professional advice and input, especially JDW for emailing a bit extensively with me. Your input was extremely helpful, so thank you. Well, if you're here, you made it to part 2 and you made it through all my rambling in part 1. So I'm gonna try to ramble a little more here for you. So it's been a while. I'm dealing with adrenal fatigue apparently, and that's been confirmed. So that's one of the reasons why I don't put out content as quickly. It's also why I don't get to drive my truck right now. But I wanted to point out the changes from part 1. In part 1 I left off, had opened the ECU, had looked at the capacitors and saw that they were actually fine, but obviously I'm not going to put it all back together with those old ones because they could start leaking in a couple of months. I did my research and found out that it should be fine to do solid polymer capacitors which don't have the liquid electrolyte in them. So what you see here, I've already soldered them in, the new ones. Because this is not a standard circuit board, it's a flexible ribbon type. I was concerned with soldering directly on it, so what I decided to do is I clipped the old capacitors off as high up as I could, and here's one here. As you can see, the wires are flush because I wanted to leave them on here so that I could use those to prevent soldering directly on the board. And as you'll see, what I did was I bent them over away from where the capacitors sit in these metal boxes, so that that will be a permanent long-term solution in case for some reason I need to replace these again in the future. I don't need to disturb the original solder on the board. And I did push on them quite a bit with this pick, and they are solid. There's nothing wrong with the original solder or those wires. I had originally planned to keep these boxes intact and bend them back, but they were bent enough and deformed enough that they weren't going to clip back in. And I also figured if for some reason I do have to do this again, it's one less hassle to deal with. So you'll see here I cut the lids off, but I left the base of the box intact. And part of that is because the boxes are metal, they're soldered on, and these capacitors can get warm or even hot. And so my thinking is partly they're there to pull heat off the capacitor into the surrounding aluminum shell, and the shell being bare aluminum, it dissipates the heat, it radiates the heat off of those. So what I'll be doing is I'll be putting some silicone on each side just to dampen any vibrations, keep those in there sturdy. But if I had to take it off again, I could just take a razor and cut that back off. Here's an example of the new capacitor. I bought 4 in case there was an issue, and I did happen to dent this one. It's hard to see. It's probably not an issue, but these are only 80 cents each, so I got an extra one just in case I made a mistake installing them. So here you can see the reading, the blue stripe. This is the negative side, which goes with this post here. That's the negative, and if you remember, the negative is towards the center where the ECU folds like a book. I also noticed that the pad on the positive is round like an oval, and the pad on the board for the negative is a rectangle. So that's another way to tell. So that blue stripe coincides with this negative wire, and that has to be soldered to the pad that has corners like a square, not round like an oval. You'll also notice on this, I filled this with silicone. One of the weaknesses of these solid polymer ones is humidity can eventually get in and slowly destroy them. And I asked a professional in the field, and they said I can seal that shut because it doesn't need to breathe. The liquid ones I think need to breathe, but these solid polymer ones don't. So that's sealed. Now, the type of silicone I'm using is this American Sealant Ink 388 electronic grade silicone. Stuff is pricier, but it's low tox. You can see VOC compliant. There's no fumes. Also, this is good for electronics because most silicone has vinegar in it. If you ever use silicone caulking, it'll smell strong of vinegar. It's because it actually has vinegar in it, and that vinegar could corrode components on here. So this is the stuff you want. I also wanted to show the different tools I tried. This one did not work for cutting these lids off. This is an angle cutter, or some people call it a dike. And this is what I used. It's a straight cut tin snips. That worked perfectly. This up here is the vent, and as you can see, I filled it mostly with silicone, but there is a tiny little hole just so that it can breathe a little bit. But again, one of the weaknesses of these polymer non-liquid capacitors is humidity. So there's a little membrane in here. It's like kind of a papery material. I'll also be on the outside putting 90% coverage, so there's just a tiny little air hole because it doesn't need to breathe much. This component here, there was a glob of gray silicone all the way across that I had to take off to desolder this capacitor, and I noticed there's two holes on the top. So I'm going to put some more silicone on there to plug those just in case. I don't know what this component is. I tried to look it up, but I couldn't figure it out. So just in case the factory wanted those holes to be plugged, I will be putting some silicone on that as well. I also decided I will put silicone around these to dampen any vibrations and to seal off that metal from any humidity or anything that could get in here. I'll also go over everything one last time with a Q-tip with rubbing alcohol to make sure You know, there was a few times I was touching this stuff without gloves on. I want to make sure that there's no skin oils or anything left behind that would slowly corrode over time. I did all the research on this because I want this to be a lifelong lasting fix. I don't want to have to do this again in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. I did decide to paint my outer shell. Didn't do a perfect job, but it's just, you know, it's whatever. Just because I noticed there was a little bit of white corrosion. Aluminum does corrode. It doesn't rust as quickly as iron or steel, but it does corrode left to the elements. The inside is not getting painted. I also wanted to say I did take this out, plug it in and test it with the truck, and it started right up. Everything worked perfectly. I ran it for half an hour, tried all the lights off and on, the blinkers, the hazards, the radio, the air conditioning, the fan. I also ran a code scanner, and there was no codes coming up. So I'm not going to be able to put mileage on it yet, because again, I said, you know, I've got adrenal fatigue. I'm not in an active lifestyle right now, but I will be at some point. So I can't tell you that I've got 5,000 miles on these and everything's perfect, but I can say that I run it for half an hour and there was no issues. So I believe that this is going to be perfectly fine. Really quick on these new polymer capacitors, the research I did. Oh yeah, by the way, so these markings, don't know all of it, but this 220 here is the microfarads. I matched it 220 and then 25 volts. And remembering the old one was 220 microfarads, 25 volts. The new brand is United Chemicon. Came in this bag from DigiKey. Here's the part number. The only two companies I would buy these from is DigiKey or Mauser, and I'll leave their websites in the description as well. I don't know anything about anyone else. I definitely don't recommend going to Amazon or eBay for capacitors. You want the stuff made in Japan, not made in China. I will add any updates in the future if anything changes on my results. And again, your experience may be different. If you do what I did, you do so at your own risk. But I think it's unlikely you'll have any issues as long as you know what you are doing with soldering and such. If you don't know much about soldering, I suggest you learn all about that first. There are many great YouTube videos teaching about that. There are many things that can go wrong if you aren't gentle and patient in working with circuit boards. My intention with these videos was not to show you how to do it, but to give you the basic information needed and what worked for me, including the part numbers and such, if you do have the necessary skills and experience and are confident you can do it. Also, the solid polymer capacitors are much more sensitive to overheating during the soldering process. What this means is you will want to minimize the temperature and duration of time you have your tip on the solder joint. I used an adjustable heat soldering iron with Chip Quick 6337 leaded solder. Leaded solder tends to have a lower melting point than unleaded. I turned the heat to the lowest temperature that would quickly melt the solder. I tried to remove my iron as soon as I saw the solder had joined both wires. I was able to get my soldering done in and out quickly without causing any noticeable damage to the capacitors or the board. If the iron temperature is high enough and the tip is held long enough to the parts, they can become burned and melt other components or even remove the pads, which would make for a lot more repair work. So again, only attempt this if you are confident you know what you are doing. I will link below the other YouTubers that helped me and some of the unique tools and parts I used in this video. Anyways, that's that. I hope this video has been helpful and maybe a tiny bit entertaining. God bless you, Jesus loves you, and we keep trucking.